Hey, this workshop is going to look at using a familiar material in an unfamiliar way. We're going to use recyclable material to make prints using an intaglio method. First, you'll need some Tetra Pak. This is usually found in juice or nut milk bottles, or you can also use clean cardboard. If you're using cardboard, you'll also need PVA glue. This will help later. You'll also need some sort of ink. This is water-based block printing ink. Oil-based will also work. You can even use acrylic paint, but you'll need to work fast because it dries a lot quicker. Next, you'll need a roller. A rolling pin from the kitchen will absolutely work, but here I've got a brayer for printing. You can use pretty much anything as long as you can apply a lot of pressure and roll it. You can also use a can or a wine bottle or various things like that if you don't have a rolling pin. I also have a tray. This just helps keep the ink off the table. You don't necessarily need this, but I would recommend covering any surfaces you don't want to get ink on. Next, you'll need something for the mark making. An etching needle or artist's scalpel would be great, but a Stanley knife can also work. It just might not be as precise. This also works with a safety pin if you have one of those. Again, it might be a bit less precise, but you can still get really good results. You'll also need paper. This is just cartridge paper out of a sketchbook. It doesn't need to be printing paper or anything. You could also use handmade paper. Either way, it'll need to be dampened with water later, so it's best to avoid anything too thin. I also have some kitchen roll. This will be used to rub the ink onto and off the printing plate. So here we have a piece of Tetra Pak. You can cut it to whatever size you want. There's always going to be a natural texture from the creasing. It's up to you whether you want to incorporate this into your design, or cut a piece with as little texture as possible. I think it can be quite nice when used. Little creases work really well for things like lightning if you're doing a sky, or just creating abstract texture, which creates different tones. The smooth surfaces are where the ink is going to come off, so these areas will be a lighter tone. Anywhere with texture is where the ink's going to sit, so where you mark the material, it will result in darker tones on the final print. Essentially, by making marks, you're creating wells for the ink. These marks can be thin lines that will appear black. Alternatively, you can create larger areas of texture by peeling off the top surface of the material like this. It can be quite fiddly, but that's okay. This area will be the darkest. So now we're going to apply the ink to the plate. First, we're going to put a modest amount of ink onto the kitchen roll. Then we're going to work the ink onto the Tetra Pak by rubbing it. You want to make sure it's worked into the marks you've made so that the paper will pick up the ink when it gets printed. Don't worry if it looks like there's a lot of ink right now, because we're then going to rub it back off of the smooth surfaces. Be fairly gentle when you do this, because if you press too hard it might start peeling up the design, especially if it's more intricate. When removing the ink, it's best done in circular motions, so you can remove more or less ink depending on how light you want the smooth area to appear. If you're using cardboard, you can put a blob of PVA glue onto the areas you want light, and then add the ink once it's dry. Once we've inked the printing plate, we need to dampen our paper on both sides. You can do this using a wet cloth or paper towel, a sponge, or just by laying the paper on a tray of water. It's important that it's wet enough that it's flexible and will mould into the grooves you've made, but not so wet that it's too delicate or dripping with water. Now we need to gently place the damp paper over the inked printing plate and it's ready to roll. When rolling, apply as much pressure as possible. If using a rolling pin, you can put a clean tea towel between the paper and the roller just to stop the roller getting dirty. Roll from several angles to make sure you get good coverage. Okay, so here's the result. You can see the darkest area is where there's the most texture. You can also see where it's darker around the edges, where I took less ink off. The natural crease in the Tetra Pak has created this line in the final print. I really like these natural lines, especially because they're hard to replicate through mark making yourself. We can also see the thin lines that appear black and bold. You can create lines to look however you want. You can do something abstract and focus on the mark making process, or you can cut a specific design. Whatever you want to do.